Welcome to Chapter 10 of our textbook, The Medieval World, the years 1250 to 1350. Very short period of time, a bare 100 years. However, we're going to be dealing with a lot of different subjects at this particular period of time, especially because there's going to be a lot of changes in Europe, and the sources of those changes are, for some situations, will not be based in Europe. They will be based outside of Europe. And of course, we'll start with one of the biggest players of the age. Um, this gentleman will be talking about the effect in Europe of the Mongol Empire. Now, the Mongols are nomadic people, or were nomadic people, who lived in the Central Asian steppes. They moved around with their herds. They raised livestock and horses. They were nomadic. They could live off the land. Very tough people, extremely good horsemen. But one of the members of the Mongol people, a man named Temujin, or as we know him in the West, Genghis Khan, is going to decide to use his power as a leader in the community to put together a very large, very, at the time, seemingly unstoppable military force. And that's what he'll do. His idea is to take and create an empire that stretches from China all the way to Europe, which is going to mean having to conquer a huge amount of area in order to build up and run the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road had been there before. It was very difficult to transverse. There were bandits everywhere. And so it took a long time to get goods from China to the West and money from the West to China. And it is Genghis Khan's idea to make this easier. And so he'll start taking land. He will build up certain cities and trading posts along the Silk Road. Cities such as Tashkent, Samarkand, and Bukhara, and make these very wealthy, important places to stop along the Silk Road. He will not stop, and then his family will not stop conquering until they conquer China. They will conquer a good chunk of the Middle East, and they will make it into Russia and take quite a bit of Russia. They'll make it to Russia about 1240, and then they stop. And we're not quite sure why they stopped, because they could have conceivably kept going, but they do stop at that point and settle down and build the infrastructure of the Silk Road and create an empire, one of the biggest empires of the time. The battle where the Mongols are stopped is the Battle of Liegnitz in 1241. That's as far as they go. Kiev is now under Mongol control. It is going to be an important city. But when we're saying Mongol control, not quite right, because the communities, the areas that the Genghis Khan and his descendants take over, they're normally called Khanates, after Khan, of course. Uh, they will lead them in a particularly interesting way. They will allow the people there to keep their own government, to keep their own religion, to basically keep doing what they have been doing. And in order to make sure that they are behaving themselves, they have to send a wagon load of gold uh, every so often to the head of the Khanate. And the head of the Khanate will pretty much leave them alone. Um, and so losing this area of southern Russia is going to put a break for a brief period of time between Kiev and Constantinople, which means that the leadership of Russia is going to move. Uh, Russia is basically uh, under the control of multiple different princes at this time, and one leader in particular will rise to the top and become the emperor of the area we know as Russia. But that's going to be a little bit in the future. Moscow is chosen for the place where this leader will rule from. It's quite a ways inland. It has very few ties directly to the west. And it was it created a uh, severe breach between the Russians and the Europeans. That's going to last for quite some time. But the importance of moving to Moscow for the leadership of Russia was to defend the Orthodox Church and make sure that they kept their own power. And so we'll see Russia change extensively because of the influence of the Mongols. So as we speak about the Khanates, Genghis Khan, after his death, the rules of having of the Mongol traditions basically said that land had to be divided up between the sons of the family, and Genghis Khan had at least 4 sons. And so the Khanates were divided up into 4 parts, and normally that would mean the end of an empire. Not in this case. But each of these Khanates will have a different Khan in charge of them. The Ilkhanate, where they will take a great amount of the Middle East away from the Abbasid dynasties and the other Muslim dynasties that are there. The Khanate of the Golden Horde, run by Batu Khan, will be in charge of the area north of the Caspian Sea and into the Russian principalities. The Chagatai Khanate will be the home area of the Mongols, where they are the most well established, and of course the different cities that they create along the Silk Road to be rest stops for merchants and traders, and of course China, or the Khanate of the Great Khan. This will be, of course, Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, will complete this, and the Chinese will call that the Yuan dynasty. And the thing about China is that it is so big and so old that even if someone comes in and invades and takes it over, they are subsumed into Chinese culture. So seeing portraits of Kublai Khan, he looks Chinese. He looks nothing like one would expect a Mongol to look. He looks like a Chinese emperor. And so this is how the Mongol Empire is going to break into pieces, but not fall apart. It's not going to take, it's going to take something much bigger to destroy this empire. But for 100 years, the 100 years we're going to be talking about, we will see what's historians call the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. This territory that they will take over stretches from the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean, 1/5 of the world's surface. So 1/5 of the landmass. There will not be one particular ruler, but they will expect tribute from those territories they control. And this kind of distribution of power makes the Mongol rule very flexible, very adaptable. As I said, Kublai Khan, when he takes China, looks exactly like a Chinese emperor, and seemingly built, seemingly a Chinese emperor. And they will use some of the things, some of the ideas that we had seen before in Roman and Hellenistic models, in that there will be multiple emperors. They will be ruling over a large part of the empire, and they will be encouraging trade. These rulers were religiously tolerant. The Mongols themselves had started out as animists. There will be some who will convert to Islam. There will be some who will convert to other religions, but for the most part, they won't disturb the religions that are there. But that does not mean they're not going to do damage. Very much the same way that Alexander the Great would come to cities and say, surrender or die. Those that chose the die part and would fight back would be destroyed ruthlessly by the Mongols. And of course, as I said with Alexander the Great, you only have to do that a couple of times before people get the idea and do not oppose you. The Mongols will also use slavery extensively. They will enslave people and move them around. They will forcibly relocate some people. And their conquests are going to be especially bloody, and they're going to devastate areas. Baghdad will be very badly damaged by the Mongols in their attempt to take it over. Successful, by the way. So the Mongols are going to be covering caravan routes from the Mediterranean all the way through China. And they will police these routes. They're going to make sure the travelers are safe, that they have places to stop, that there are facilities for them. And it's going to streamline trade between East and West. This is also a moment where we're going to see many Europeans travel to China. It is a long and arduous road, but people like Marco Polo will be traveling to China. Marco Polo actually goes with his uncle on a merchant trip, a trading trip to China, and stays there for about a decade, and then comes back and writes a book about his experience. And it is an extremely popular book. People are interested in what China is like, because the vast majority will never make that trip. The Mongol rule will disintegrate thanks to, well, something I'm going to talk about at the end of the chapter. The Mongol rule will be destroyed by a microbe, by something that is smaller than anything visible. You have to see it under a microscope. And that will be the bubonic plague. I will get into that. The network actually was not sustainable. There were also various ways to move goods by ship, which is going to take away some of the need for traveling overland. You can also ship a lot more by ship than carrying it overland. And because of the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, as it's called, the Europeans are not going to be that interested in buying the luxury goods that were available from China, that they would have to concentrate very hard on survival. The last of the Mongol rulers in China was thrown out about 1368. So 20 years after the rise of the bubonic plague, that was when we see uh, a new dynasty arise in China. And the break of the end of the Mongol Empire is so sufficient, so complete, that the people of Europe, when they eventually got around to wanting to trade again, uh, could not find the trade goods that they wanted. So this will spur a great deal of investigation, discovery, travel, technology. It really spurs a new movement in Europe. However, the money that had been sent by Europe to buy the luxury goods in China stayed in China. And so Europe experienced a shortage of gold and silver. Africa was a major source of gold. They had not found gold in Europe, and it won't be until the 14th century until they find some sufficient silver mines in Europe. But the Europeans desperately want that gold, and they will extend their colonial empires to North Africa in order to help get that gold. The gold itself came from Central Africa, south of the Sahara Desert. That gold had to cross over the Sahara Desert in exchange for manufactured goods from Europe, and, interestingly enough, salt. Salt was needed by the people of Central Africa. And in return, the people of Central Africa sent gold and slaves. The European trade going to Africa had not been that new. It had been going for a long time, but there was a real need for gold, and a even more pressing need for silver, because there wasn't a lot in Europe that was worth gold, but silver was far more easy to expend. And that silver and gold had flown east in order to buy spices and other luxury goods from China. So they really needed silver. However, with all this trade, we saw a growth of economic tools. Running a business was not easy back then, still isn't easy today. but they're doing it before Excel spreadsheets. And they had to figure out how to keep books, how to deal with profit and loss. Because in Europe, until this period, it had been essentially the networks of Jews who had done the banking, because it was illegal for Christians to loan money to other Christians with interest. And that's how you get people to loan money. And so we saw in the beginning of the 13th century, the pogroms, the wholesale killing of Jews, and of course, the expulsion of Jews from Europe. So how did the Europeans handle the banking crisis? Well, they started to ignore the rules about Christians loaning money to Christians, and they had to set up banking systems and accounting systems. The trading will be accomplished by those people who had sufficient capital to loan, and they will work up partnerships in order to create the goods and to put together shipfuls of goods. And rather than have one person put everything they have into a shipment that could get lost, get stolen, or go to the bottom of the ocean, they created partnerships. And so multiple people can put a little bit of investment into a shipment. And that way, if the shipment was lost, then everyone lost a little bit. But if a shipment made it back, well, everybody got to share. And that, of course, would require legal documents to make sure that people are not getting cheated, etc. So bookkeeping is going to come in its own during this 100 years. One of the most important families that will start up a banking house starts in the city of Florence, which is in northern Italy. And it is the Medici family, or the de Medici family. This is a family that has plenty of wealth, really good connections, and they become the richest family pretty much in Europe. And they will open up multiple branches of their bank throughout Europe. They will be loaning and spending and using special gold currency. This currency was minted in the city of Florence. It was called a florin, of course, after the city of Florence. But it's unique in a couple ways. Number one, it was created, as I say, in the city of Florence, which was a republic. Not a kingdom, a republic. And so the coinage was very different. There's no king on the coinage. And when kings and other people minted coins, the rest of Europe, they put the king's face on it. Not these coins from Florence. We do see the fleur-de-lis, or the flower, on the back of the coin, which is a symbol for Florence. But on the other side, we see a personage out of the New Testament of the Bible, John the Baptist. He is the first man, according to Christian tradition, who recognizes Jesus of Nazareth and baptizes him. And so John the Baptist has a special place in Christian tradition as the person who sees clearly and sees the future and what's going to happen. And so, in a way, Florence is telling the rest of Europe that it is the Republic that is going to be the future of Europe. They were a little bit ahead of their time because Florence will stop being a republic, but that's a little bit later. But these florins were accepted throughout Europe. They were considered the most stable and effective and valuable currency in all of Europe. So they were welcome everywhere. Along with business, banking, and bookkeeping, there's going to be a lot of other things that will basically be invented at this time during the 13th century. One of those things, eyeglasses. Now, these early eyeglasses fit on the nose. They didn't have the temple pieces, and they were simply for magnification. But of course, um, even magnification, even for us older people, being able to read, as you get older, you need greater and greater magnification. So eyeglasses are going to extend the working lives of scholars, of bookkeepers, of all sorts of people doing various jobs. Another item that will come of its own is the magnetic compass. Simply points to the north. The Chinese are the ones that discover it. They will take a needle, a steel needle, and a piece of silk and rub it so that it becomes electrostatic charge, and then lay the needle very gently on a cork that's in a pan of water, and the needle always points to the north. This becomes huge for sailors because as one is traveling, one wants to know where one is. Now you can spend your time traveling very long distances by going close to the shore. Ships did not venture out into the middle of the ocean, especially not the Mediterranean Ocean, because how could you tell where you were going? Magnetic compass is going to change that, because all of a sudden you're going to be able to steer your ship based on a fixed measurement, a fixed standard, and that is what is north. And so you can figure out by the degrees what direction you're going, and eventually figure out where you're going. And they will come up with new maps called portolani. And it's easier if I show you what that looked like. And so I'll do that in a moment. But another step ahead for the Europeans came in the form of the mechanical clock. It is going to be, the mechanical clock was an outgrowth of the windmill and the water wheel, in that it was just spinning an axle, but that spinning had to be regulated in order to tell the time. And the concept of regulating time was new with the mechanical clock. Now, they had Europeans had sundials, they had hourglasses, they had water clocks, but all three of those demand work to be done every hour, half hour, whenever a hourglass has to be turned over, and if you forget, then it's difficult to measure your time. Um, Sundials don't work at night. Mechanical clocks do. Mechanical clocks could be set with gravity pull. That is what the chain and the pendulum are for, and that allowed them to work day and night. The concept of regulating time in a mechanical way was also new, because the concept of hours, it's weird. Okay. Before the mechanical clock, before this concept of mechanical time always ticking consistently as we go, there was an understanding that uh, there would be 12 hours of night and 12 hours of day. But Professor Griffith, we know that the lengths of the day and the lengths of the night change over the course of the year, especially as you go away from the equator. Exactly. But that was not a concern. They imagined the dark part of the day being 12 full hours and the light part of the day being 12 full hours. And those hours shrank or stretched out according to the time of the year. So it would still be 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. It's just that if your day was short, as it gets in December, you had very short hours. But it didn't matter because you did not need to deal with hours that frequently. Uh, and everybody shared pretty much the same way of telling time, and that was listening for the bells of the church, which would be rung at the middle of the day and the times when prayers were to be said or when Mass would start. Mechanical clocks, being that ticking entity, is going to let people think about their time differently. And that idea of stretching hours is not going to happen. Now, this is an image of the mechanical clock in the old town hall of the city of Prague. This is a modern photograph. That clock is still there. It was created around the 13th century, a little bit around this time, and later part of that time. And because it had to be big for all the mechanisms to work, because it had to be high so that the chain had room to move up and down, they put it aside of buildings so that everyone could share it. Now, this clock has the day broken into 24 hours. It also has a very helpful um, zodiac dial so that people could tell when which symbol of the zodiac was in the sun, etc. Because it's all determined where the sun is at that time of year. Very important for physicians to know what the sign of the zodiac was, because they cast horoscopes even at this time as a way of diagnosing and figuring out how to treat their patients. At the hour, a huge crowd gathers, and a little show gets put on. The rooster, way up here in the top window, starts crowing. Well, if you ever go to the Wegmans in Chantilly, there's a rooster, that mechanical rooster that crows. Same idea. However, these two windows open up and there is a show of dolls that move around on wheels that go through the go and look out the window as if people are wandering up there and looking out the window. These little figurines are animated a little bit, so they move around. It's it's really quite something to see, even for a clock that is that old. It gathers a huge crowd every day at noon and during the times when it strikes the hour. But because everyone saw that, all of a sudden you didn't tell your friend to meet you at downtown or at the city hall or the market right around noon. You could make an appointment. Say, I will meet you there at 3:30. Uh, now you had the means to tell the time that way, and everyone else did. But the passing of time is going to line up with the understanding of banking and accruing interest on loaned money. So obviously, as these things pass, you need to uh, keep an eye on how long it is and when you have to make payments and that sort of thing. So these clocks are going to meld beautifully into these new ideas of um, interest, business, and money. So this is a portolani. This is a special map that was made in the 13th century. And it's got a pretty good rendition of the Mediterranean Sea being in the center of the map. So of course, this is what we're talking about. And what seems to look like uh, just coloration along the coastline was actually the names of ports or the names of cities. And so you could navigate from one point to another by simply going from one point to another and just passing one and passing one, and how approximately how far it is. You knew how many ports that you had to go by, etc. And it allowed you to say, aha, I am in the port of let's use Sicily, let's use Syracuse, and I want to get to Cyprus. I know that north is that way, and so I can find the compass direction for Cyprus and use compass direction. It was dead reckoning. In other words, they're figuring out how they're going, they're figuring out roughly the directions, and this was all subject to the wind movement, etc. But you didn't get totally lost. So these kind of maps were very jealously guarded by captains of ships, by navigators, etc. Your navigator became extremely important. So more knowledge about the world, because we are seeing new ways of seeing the world, new ideas about how to understand it. One of the foremost thinkers, an important thinker of the day, is William of Ockham. And you see here's an image of him. He is a monk, and you can see him using the mnemonic of counting on his knuckles to remember something. But William of Ockham is going to be very different than the theologians who came before him, because Thomas Aquinas, who we talked about last chapter, believed one could find God through faith. William of Ockham is not so sure. He thought that finding God would be a matter of reading and understanding Scripture and gaining a revelation because of your reading of scripture or hearing, attending mass or hearing a homily, etc. So that is revelatory. You would have the truth or the answer revealed to you. And William of Ockham said that's how you can understand God, because William of Ockham thought there's still too many mysteries about what is written in the Bible. Um, that rather than just say, well, they're mysteries, why not divide the thought process and basically say, let us accept that God can be found through revelation of reading the text, but other things on earth cannot be found out that way. The other things of earth, if we are reading texts about them, what if they're wrong? And so William of Ockham basically says divide the two, accept that you don't need reason to find God, you need a revelation, as opposed to the natural world that we can experience, examine, measure. All of these new items, these new technologies coming into play here. So he will encourage investigation of the natural world. William of Ockham is one of the earliest thinkers about the scientific method. We didn't call people scientists back then. If we called them anything, we called them natural philosophers, because they're still using philosophy in order to understand, still using reason and logic to understand the world. But William of Ockham is going to take the older Greek philosophers to task, because the they followed a idea that was as old as Plato, that the Neoplatonic thought is what it is called. And that idea held that one thing could be a reflection of something else. It's a really difficult philosophy to kind of wrap your head around. In that, let me use this example. A Neoplatonist basically said a chair is a chair because it has the essence of chairness to it. And somewhere in the universe is the perfect chair. And that this chair in your room has the essence or part of that universal chair. And that universal chair is the true chair. And William of Ockham says the chair is not a chair because it's got part of the universal chair in it. That chair is a chair because it's made out of wood, because someone carved it up. And that he contends that only individual things are real, that one thing has not got the essence of something else. And his ideas are going to be a huge influence in medieval universities. So his idea of investigating nature is truly the beginnings of empiricism, that knowledge rests on experience alone, what we can learn, as opposed to what is revealed to us. Okay, so he is a very important figure. Now, you might hear of a term called Occam's razor. I'm going to discuss that in class because it's a lot easier for me to discuss it than it is named after William of Ockham. It was not stated succinctly by William of Ockham. It was actually formulated by a 20th century philosopher named Bertrand Russell, but it is based on his reading of William of Ockham and Occam's ideas on empiricism. So Occam inspired Occam's razor, so to speak. We will see changes in literature as well. Because you see, pretty much everything until this point had been written in Latin in Europe. Latin was thought to be the proper language for anything written down. Anything important enough to be written down should be written down in Latin as an important language. But the people did not speak Latin. Latin was how was the recitation of the Mass was in Latin. And books were in Latin, but it was not necessarily a way that people communicated with each other. And in comes a brilliant, thoughtful poet by the name of Dante Alighieri, who's from the Italian peninsula. And he had quite the nose, quite the aquiline nose. We have descriptions of him, so that's why we know. He is going to decide to write a poem in his native tongue, in his vernacular. Vernacular is the term we use for the language you learned growing up, your mother tongue. Well, we don't use that term that much anymore. And his work, called The Divine Comedy, is a very long poem. It's actually quite a nice poem. I've read big chunks of it. And it describes a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. And it is a combination of some of the things that Alighieri had read in ancient Roman writings, but also is infused with Christian wisdom and theology. And it is Dante's description of hell or inferno that forms our imagination of hell. Many of the things that we think about as being in hell and what hell is with multiple levels and tortures and all this is not biblical. It is from Dante and his work. I have a video that I want you to watch about, it was a essay I created about Dante's Inferno. And it was a fun one to make too. Anyway, so this work is a beautiful fusion of Christian ideas and cultures, Latin learning from the ancient classics, and vernacular artistry. Dante stands up and says, "My language is good enough to be poetry." Big step forward. He's considered a big deal when it comes to writing. Now, speaking of, we talked a little bit about the church's ideas and Dante's ideas about hell, purgatory, and paradise. And that is, Dante's ideas and theology. What we are actually seeing happening in the church at the highest levels was nothing that had anything to do with theology and everything to do with politics, power, and wealth. And the moment we're talking about is an unusual period in the history of the papacy and the history of the Pope, known as the Babylonic captivity of the papacy. Sounds bizarre. Let me go into detail explaining it. And I also have a video if you would like to watch that as well. But in the 13th century, in the 1200s, the papacy in Rome seemed to go back and forth between two dynastic families. And one would be made pope, and then the next time the other guy would be made pope. And this is going to cause a lot of jealousy, a lot of anger, and a lot of fighting between two rival families. Because if you had a family member who was pope, that meant a lot. That meant a lot of important connections, etc. And so it will get to the point where the pope's life is in danger by this arguing back and forth. In fact, a pope will die from being beaten by one of the rival families. And so the Pope, who is elected in 1309, is going to find the absolute safest place on the Italian peninsula in which to live safely. And that is the south of France. It is not on the Italian peninsula at all. It is hundreds of miles away from Rome. And in fact, it is in a very large palace slash castle that these popes move everything into. And it is a magnificent palace. It's still there. If you watch the video, we shot it at that palace. It wasn't just moving the Pope, it was all the bureaucracy, all the paperwork, all the needs to collect the money and the obligations to the churches, etc., etc. And it starts happening not in Rome, but in Avignon. And the people now that are surrounding the Pope are no longer people of Rome or people of the Italian peninsula. They are French. And so we see a group of French popes, French bishops, French administrators, and France seems to be gaining real authority over the Pope. And that is a big problem because if France has any enemies, could the Pope be swayed to, say, excommunicate people? Oh, yes. And so one of the reasons why the Pope was in Rome, because it was a place that wasn't claimed by other kingdoms. It was kind of an independent area we know as the Papal States. And so now we see the whole aspect of the papacy change drastically. Also, the people of different areas that didn't agree with France because we're going to get into a little bit of a war uh, between France and England. There is going to be some jealousies. France is getting all the money. France is getting all the popes. France is getting all of the bishops. How does this happen? How come we're sending them money? Is going to be kind of the idea. And we're going to have at least one pope, Clement VI, who is going to be accused of selling offices. Do you want to be bishop? It's going to cost you. This was really the height of corruption. Also, there were rumors that he had been having sex, which is, if you're supposed to be a celibate pope, not a good thing. Also, there was a lot of money coming in to the Avignon Pope, lots of it, huge amounts of it. And this was going to fix up the castle. The castle is huge. And so the rest of Europe sees the Pope as, especially Clement VI, as corrupt, as living in luxury, as doing all sorts of things that are not very popular. And at the same time, we are seeing stronger and stronger territorial monarchies. We're now no longer talking of, in certain areas, kings of small areas. They are now kings of larger and larger areas. And that takes more sophistication, and that takes greater armies to protect it, etc., etc. And needing strong ties to the church. Because remember, kings needed the church to tell them it was okay to be kings. That claim to moral and spiritual leadership was really important to the people of their realms. And so the claims, the problem of sovereignty is that the claims had to be backed up with real power. So they had to have an army. These kings were interested usually in expanding their territory. So they are taking over other people's territory. And the process of taking and keeping power was aggressive and very, very often violent. So it is a difficult time to go against the king. These kings wanted power to ensure their own survival. And because they had the money and the willpower to do it, they built protective structures around themselves. However, there are things that are beyond the reach of even kings. One is the weather or the climate. Another is population. Between 1000 CE and 1300 CE, Europe's population is estimated to have tripled from reports, etc. Because the population had grown so much, they needed to grow more food. And of course, the most important food to grow was wheat. And so rather than they had no other choice but to turn land that had been marginal or had never been used before into places to plant wheat. So they cleared out forests, which is kind of a dumb move in a world that's entirely heated by wood fires. They drained marshes and they got rid of pasture land, which meant that there were fewer sheep, fewer goats, fewer cows. And so even at that, even at pushing the boundaries of where things could grow and what to grow, Europe was still barely able to feed itself because everything had been turned over to growing wheat and growing grapes for wine, because that was another very important crop. And this time, between 1000 CE and 1300 CE, had been a warming period. Things were warmer during that time. We know that not because people had thermometers and kept track. We know that by the types of crops that grew where and when. And we knew that there were grapes that could only be grown in areas that did not freeze or had minimal amounts of freezing, that were growing further north and further north and further north. England became a place where grapes were grown for wine. So I always make the joke that if you will understand the drastic nature of our current climate change and the warming trends, if you happen to go into Wegmans, into the wine section, and you know they've got it all divided up by country, Italy, France, Spain, etc. When you see a sign up there that says England, you know things have changed drastically. Back to our story. All of a sudden, 1300, this warming period reverses. All of a sudden, and I mean very quickly, the rainfall patterns change. There becomes shorter growing seasons. They can't grow what they grew in the north anymore. And agricultural production drops drastically. In a region that could barely feed itself, you can probably guess how dangerous this would be. And what will happen is a cooling period and famine. I have a image of a barn or a house in winter and what it was like to be a agricultural worker in winter. They did not make houses without walls. This was done by the artist, but it shows you kind of the conditions, what happens when it gets cold, and the things people needed to do to survive the cold. But fewer and fewer, less and less produce means that it's going to be dangerous as far as people starving to death. And the humans aren't making it any better, because this is the moment of the 100 Years' War. This is a war between England and France, in which they are fighting each other over land and territory. And that 100 Years' War is going to divide Europe along two lines. Those who support England and those who support France. And it's going to get crazy, but I'll get into that next chapter. So, famine is not, it's almost dinner time. When's dinner? I'm so hungry. It is months without proper nutrition. These 7 years of famine are going to weaken, malnourish people, and especially children are affected by famine, worse than adults in many situations. There are many diseases that are based on not getting enough nutrition. Scurvy, which is humans do not get enough vitamin C. Rickets, which humans do not get enough vitamin D. There's several different kinds of diseases, as I said, that affect people, and especially children. They don't develop. Children need certain types of nutrition, especially fat, to develop the brain cells, etc. When they don't get proper nutrition, terrible things happen. And even if they do survive into adulthood, they are drastically weakened. The famine is going to kill animals. Well, people are going to be killing animals in order to eat them, and people are going to die. There are written reports of people eating grass, eating the bark off of trees, simply to keep something in their stomach so they don't feel quite so hungry, and dead bodies on the road of people starved to death. And the famine is going to disrupt trade. There's going to be fewer people making things and growing food, which is going to exasperate starvation. And of course, when you get fewer and fewer goods being chased around by more and more people, prices are going to go up. So everything gets more expensive. The continuous problems of this: seeds that used to grow in an area, now they don't germinate because maybe they're too cold, or maybe the amount of moisture is not enough. Cold summers that don't, you don't grow as much. Autumns spent foraging, and foraging was terribly dangerous in the medieval period, because we're still talking about areas ruled by lords of the manor or large areas ruled by kings, and they want to have the area for hunting. And so they would make it illegal to kill game on certain plots of land. It was reserved for the nobility. Only the nobility can go out and hunt. If you were caught poaching, it was a death sentence. But the choice was either, get some food or watch your children starve to death. And there's going to be a lot of problems coming up with that. And as I said before, the children in particular are going to be devastated. They will grow up, if they do, into weakened adults in many, many cases. Oh, and it gets worse. Because remember the Silk Road. Remember how interconnected everyone was. Well, in the Black Sea, connected to the Silk Road there, the Genoese, which is Genoa is a port in the north of the Italian peninsula. There were merchants who had sent sailors and built a colony in the Black Sea. And it had been, quite profoundly, they made a lot of money off of it. So they wanted to keep this colony going. However, all of a sudden, people in this colony started dying very quickly. And so the merchants who could basically got on ships and left, thinking that what was the problem, they blamed it on miasma, which means bad air. What they did not blame it on were the rats that were in the goods they were delivering and in the ships. And the ships back then had rats. People had rats throughout the area, and so consequently, they didn't think of rats. Actually, at some points during this period, they blamed cats. They thought cats spread the Black Death, and so they, in certain areas, they went about killing cats. Cats didn't spread it. It was actually something called the Black Death, or what we call it today, the bubonic plague. It is a microbe, Yersinia pestis. It is inside of fleas that live on the rats. And then rats sometimes died of it, and the fleas had to find a new host, humans. People oftentimes lived in close contact with livestock, so they didn't notice fleas, although it is not true that the people of the Middle Ages never took baths. They actually did bathe quite often, but it was still very difficult to keep your clothes clean because it was a colder climate. People wore more clothes, so there was more places for fleas to crawl in. And what happened was that if you were bitten by an infected flea or an infected rat, it would attack your lymphatic system, your lymph nodes, and your lymph nodes would swell up like the size of oranges. And your lymph nodes here underneath your chin. There are lymph nodes underneath your arm and lymph nodes in your groin. Those would start swelling and turning black. These black swellings were known as buboes. And so that's where we get the term bubonic plague. Now, that type of the bubonic plague, generally, you had horrible fevers. You were thirsty. You had these horrible swellings that were extremely painful. If you weren't strong, if you couldn't fight it off, you would die within 3 days. Some people lived. About half of the people of the population of Europe contracted the bubonic plague. Only about a third of the population of Europe died from it, but 1/3 of the population died from this. Now, the bubonic method, where you were bitten by fleas and your lymph nodes swelled up and turned black, that's what we call it, the Black Death, that was only one way of it spreading. And remember, this took 3 days to kill you. The septicemic form of the bubonic plague, septicemic, that means it's bloodborne. It got into your blood system, maybe through the bite of an infected rat, maybe because you touched somebody who had it and it got into a cut. I mean, there was lots of different ways to get septicemic plague, and that generally killed people within 24 hours or so. That too, horrible fevers, etc. But the scariest by far of the transmission of the Black Death was the pneumonic plague. That was breathing on each other. We know about that now with COVID-19, except they did not understand that. But the pneumonic plague was you gave it to each other through coughing and talking to each other. And we're living at a time where all cooking and all heating was done with wood fires. If you've ever been camping for an extended period of time or have lived in a place where you warm yourself with wood fires, you cough a lot. So, it wouldn't be unusual for someone to start coughing. But this was the pneumonic form, and we have written accounts of people being perfectly healthy, going to work, and never coming home. That people died within 8 hours of contracting this. So, because it had so many different manifestations, it was terrifying and it panicked people. Literally, if someone in your house started coughing, everybody left. They just left you in the house, went somewhere else. Oftentimes, to make sure no one gets the disease, they would nail the door shut, and you either lived or died on your own. It's reported, people died of thirst. They didn't get enough water. So they survived the bubonic plague and then died of thirst. So panic happened. Resignation happened. They closed cities. People were not traveling as much. Imagine staying at home for a very long time, not going places. They didn't have the delivery services we have today. We might feel for them. We might kind of understand what it's like to be stuck at home for a year. That's why I'm videotaping this lecture. But imagine a time without internet, without Zoom, without television, without delivery, and there is no cure, and there is no vaccine. And that's where everyone was. It will come from the Black Sea and land in, the boat makes landfall on Sicily in December 31st, 1347, and it spreads from there. And it will move back and forth in Europe. It'll go through a place and then it'll be gone. And that might come back a decade later. It will move throughout Europe for 300 years, that there will be pockets of plague. There are handfuls of places that were not stricken by plague, but those were indeed quite rare. It took 3 years to go from Sicily into Scandinavia. There's just no stopping it. And that's why the Silk Road was closed down. That's why the Chinese basically threw out the Mongols. This is what's going to end Pax Mongolica and their rule. Of course, people are going to try to blame other people. The search for scapegoats. A scapegoat, um, that's an actual concept in which a village or a group of people would take a goat and place their hands on it and bless it and and say prayers and hope that their sins go into this goat, and then they let it go with the idea that the goat escapes and takes their sins with them. That's where we get the term scapegoat. But who to blame for this disease? Well, they're going to go for low-hanging fruit. They're going to blame the Jews, those few Jews that were left in Europe. They're going to get blamed. They're going to go be slaughtered again. However, in the areas, it will get to the areas that are ruled by Muslims. The Muslims have a better understanding of medicine, and so they're not going to blame the Jews. However, there will be people throughout Europe who will assume that the reason everyone is getting sick and dying is that they were insufficiently pious, that it was the wrath of God being poured out on everyone in Europe for being not good enough. And so a handful of people came to the idea that if they became the scapegoat and if they were punished for everybody else's sins, perhaps God would be kind to everyone else. And so these groups of people, we call them flagellants, would go from town to town. They would go to the marketplace. They would try to get a crowd with music and talking and this and that. They would be saying prayers, and then they would start whipping themselves, beating themselves as a way of doing penance, the idea of punishing themselves. So hopefully the people of the village or wherever they are won't be punished as well. And this turns into crowd hysteria. And people of the city or the village, wherever they are, they start joining in. And it becomes a horrible moment in time when people just lose their reason. And it bothered leaders of the cities. It bothered religious leaders who felt that this was not the right way to do it. And there will be many cities and villages and regions where this practice of flagellants will be banned. They will keep insisting on doing it to the point that the city officials in some places will have to round them up and execute them to stop them from doing this. For one thing, they could be the vectors. They could have picked up the Black Death in the last village they were in and go to the next village, and they would be the ones to spread it during this ritual in order to get rid of it. So it was a very bizarre, unusual reaction. However, there was considered some sound biblical ideas behind it of people suffering and dying to take away other people's sins. If you sometimes look at places like the Philippines during the week between Palm Sunday and Easter. There are handfuls of men who allow themselves to be crucified for a very brief time as a way of taking on uh, other people's sins, as a way of trying to get rid of their own sins. Um, and it tends to uh, turn into a hysterical moment. So um, it was one reaction that happened, but because doctors couldn't do anything, physicians couldn't do anything, the churchmen died as readily as everyone else. It slew kings and nobles and untold millions. It was pretty, um, pretty frightening. And basically, many people in Europe were resigned to the fact that it was the end of the world, that the world, everyone was going to die, and that uh, death was victorious and everyone would soon be gone. But as dark and frightening as this period was, there will be a new Europe that will emerge at the other side of this. And that Europe is changed drastically. And we'll talk about that in the next chapter. So, thank you all very much for your attention. I have been teaching this course for many, many years. I have always talked about the Black Death. Um, but it really hasn't been until this time of COVID-19 when there's this insight into the fear, into the willingness for people to stay at home, to take care of themselves, etc., that really hits home when we're talking about the bubonic plague and what happened. Obviously, the death toll for COVID-19 is nothing like that. But, uh, if you have friends or a family member who has been sick or even has passed away from it, it's still very, very, very painful. So hope that this has not been too disturbing for you. Um, Other than that, I look forward to discussing this with you in class. So take care.